If you were to visit the county of Suffolk in southern England, you might occasionally be struck by an unusual sight. Particularly after a couple of beers, you might start to question your own sanity, because some of the walls around here aren't straight. They're wavy. Sometimes called Serpentine walls, sometimes ribbon walls, but more commonly known as Crinkle Crankle walls. They're seen all over the county. There's about 100 of them in Suffolk, which is double the amount of Crinkle Crankle walls that can be found in the whole of the rest of the country. So that's just 150 of them in the whole of England. The history of these walls go way back, 3,500 years to ancient Egypt. But around 600 years ago, they started popping up in England. There's even several examples in the United States. Now I know what you're thinking. Terence, you haven't travelled hundreds of miles to Suffolk just to look at this wall. Surely you can't be serious. I am serious, and don't call me Shirley. The term Crinkle Crankle springs from the Suffolk dialect, meaning something that bends and turns. Crinkle Crankle walls in England have been credited to 17th century Dutch engineers when they were draining Marshland in East Anglia. In the 18th century, their popularity soared. To England's longest Crinkle Crankle wall, and it's possibly the longest Crinkle Crankle wall in the world. It's located in the beautiful estate village of Easton in Suffolk. It runs from the former manor house to the All Saints Church. They're commonly aligned east to west because in the 16th century they discovered that the waves in the walls made an ideal sun trap. They would catch the warming sun and fruit would be grown along its base. Wavy walls were built at a time when labour was much cheaper than the bricks, so material saving became very important. They constantly form concave and convex curves, so it's not surprising that they're also known as snake walls. The curves, of course, take up a much larger land footprint, but it's these curves that give Crinkle Crankle walls their immense strength. Had a straight wall of the same height, just one brick thick, been built on this spot 500 years ago, it wouldn't have lasted 5 minutes. The first gust of wind would have flattened it. It's these curves that provide the strength and the stability to resist lateral forces, and that includes the most powerful winds that Mother Nature can throw at it. If we were to somehow straighten out this wall, we'd find that it was only 22% longer than a straight wall. But that straight wall would have to be 2 bricks thick minimum to maintain its structural integrity against the elements, not to mention periodic buttresses that would have probably been needed. So for an extra 22% in length, you save yourself a ton of bricks. You get a wall that will stand for hundreds of years, and you get a sun trap for your fruit thrown in for good measure. Why aren't they built today? Well, I think there's 2 main reasons. Well, number 1, they do take up quite a chunk of expensive real estate. And number 2, bricks aren't as pricey as they once were. The forcing functions that once led to Crinkle Crankle walls are no longer there. In England in 1784, a brick tax was introduced, adding extra expense to an already expensive commodity. My viewers in the States won't be pleased to know that the brick tax was used by Britain to pay for wars in the American colonies. By 1805, the tax on 1,000 bricks was 5 shillings and 10 pence. Crinkle Crankle walls were a godsend. For a while, it looked like this phenomenon was going to get popular across the Atlantic. Founding father of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, built several Crinkle Crankle walls at the University of Virginia in 1819, which he also founded. It looks like he'd been inspired on a trip to England, and even did his own build calculations. And according to Wikipedia, that took some doing. The mathematical basis for the material efficiency of the Crinkle Crankle wall involves the calculation of the wall's wavelength. I can't pretend to understand it, but maybe you will. There are actually several examples in the United States of Crinkle Crankle walls, but it's in southern England that you'll find the majority of the world's supply, all of which have survived for over 300 years. Remember the operative word there, though: survived. How many didn't survive, I wonder? Crinkle Crankle walls are sturdy, and these examples are hundreds of years old. But it's important to note that these walls are the survivors. No one took photographs of Crinkle Crankle walls that fell down. After all, there's a couple of sections of our wall at Easton that look very precarious. For all we know, 10,000 may have fallen down over the centuries, leaving us with just 150 standing today. We're left with the impression that they'll defy gravity forever. At least one of you will have thought, we don't build walls as good as that today. I made a short video on survivorship bias in the summer, and to make sure we don't fall for it, I've included parts of it at the end of this video. So please stick around. I'll play it right after this channel promo. Please allow me just 20 seconds to plug this channel. Very Nearly Interesting is a brand new channel, and I need all the help I can get. Please click that like button if you've enjoyed this video. That's how YouTube knows you like it, and they'll show it to more people. And please consider subscribing. That way I might see you again. And now you can support the channel on Patreon, where you'll find exclusive content and a grateful me. There's a link in the channel description. During World War II, Britain was losing far too many planes. So wanted to begin the process of assessing damage to planes that had returned from battle. Planes were examined for bullet holes upon their return. The hope was that they could use precious resources to reinforce commonly damaged areas. This diagram was typical of the studies. Each red dot represents damage to a returning aircraft. They figured that by reinforcing these areas, they could help to save more aircraft and more lives. But they were only looking at planes that had successfully made it back to base. These were the survivors. They were well advanced with their investigations when up stepped statistician Abraham Wald. He encouraged them to take survivorship bias into account when assessing the results. His work helped to minimise bomber losses. Once they had factored in the fact that planes that never made it back to base weren't included in the study, it struck them that areas where there was no bullet damage now told a different story. Planes who got hit in these areas crashed and never made it back to base. That's why they weren't seeing damage to those areas on returning planes. They decided that they should reinforce areas with no bullet damage. It took a while, but eventually they didn't fall for survivorship bias. It took a while and it took an effort because our brains seem only to focus on the survivors. We are naturally inclined to do it. The survivors are right there in front of us. We can see them and our brain seems very stubborn in only taking the survivors into account. It's a deep-seated cognitive bias. The ancient Greek philosopher and atheist Diagoras of Melos was asked to consider survivors of a shipwreck whilst looking at a painting as proof that gods were looking after them. Luke, you who think the gods have no care of human things, what do you say to so many persons preserved from death by their especial favour? He was being urged to consider all the souls who had survived by the grace of the gods. His reply? Why, I say that their pictures are not here who were cast away, who are by much the greater number. The majority of the men were on the seabed. The overwhelming majority of failures are not in the public eye. We stubbornly focus on what we can see, the survivors. When we look at artists, film stars, YouTube stars, we are left with the perception that everyone can achieve greatness if they have the ability and make the effort. Do what they do and you can make it big. Of course, for every successful artist, film star, and YouTube star, there are tens of thousands of failed wannabes, languishing in a pit of failure and despair that we never see. I often look at old buildings and wonder why on earth we can't build beautiful buildings like that today. Why is it that buildings built like 500 years ago seem to be much better built than buildings built just last week? We just don't build buildings like that anymore. Old buildings really were better than the flimsy designs that we see today. But of course, new buildings are being built every day, and old buildings are being torn down every day. It's a constant process of renewal and renovation. Only the most beautiful, useful, and structurally sound buildings survive from one generation to the next. We're standing in awe looking at these buildings. The most beautiful, the best built, the most useful. But that's precisely why they survived. These buildings that survived were too beautiful, too useful, and too well built to tear down. These are the buildings that have survived from generation to generation. So good that each generation have deemed that particular building worthy of salvation. Again, we're struck with survivorship bias. We're looking at these ancient buildings as if that was the norm. No, they weren't the norm. They were the best. For each one of those survivor buildings, there's hundreds of thousands of buildings that were torn down because they're no longer useful, or they're slum dwellings, or they're falling down. We're left with the impression that older buildings were better built and more beautiful than today's buildings. No, we're just looking at the survivors. They are standing precisely because they are better and beautiful. In 500 years, people will be looking at buildings built in the 2020s, and they'll completely ignore the millions of terrible, shoddy and shocking buildings that we've erected. They might shed a tear for our brilliance and inventiveness, but which buildings will they be? They'll be the survivors. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please click the like button. That way YouTube will show it to more people, and please consider subscribing. That way I might see you again. And please have a look at some of the other content on the channel. There's lots of interesting things on there. Well, very nearly interesting.